I almost didn't take the shortcut, but it was late, and I was exhausted. I had been driving for nearly 8 hours, making my way back home after visiting my parents in another state. The highway was nearly deserted, nothing but miles of darkness stretching ahead of me. Then, my GPS rerouted me. A faster way, it said. Shave 20 minutes off my trip. I hesitated. The road it suggested was smaller, winding through some rural backroads, the kind you don't see on maps. But I was tired, and it was only 20 minutes shorter. So I took the turn. And that was my first mistake. At first, it was fine. The road was narrow, but paved. No streetlights, just my headlights cutting through the pitch black. The farther I drove, the more I realized how alone I was. No houses, no gas stations, just dense trees on either side of the road, pressing in like they were swallowing the world. Then, my headlights flickered, just for a second. A small glitch, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself I was just on edge. Then, something ran across the road. I slammed the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. For a split second, my headlights illuminated a shape. A man, barefoot, wearing torn clothes. His skin looked too pale, his movements jerky, like he wasn't fully in control of his body. Then, he was gone. He had disappeared into the trees. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. What the hell did I just see? I should have turned around right then, but I didn't. And that was my second mistake. I kept driving. A little faster this time, my pulse still racing. Then, my GPS glitched. The screen froze, the little blue arrow stuck in place. Great. I tried refreshing it, but it wouldn't load. That's when I saw the sign. Faded, nearly unreadable. Ashwood, population, 173. I frowned. I didn't remember passing a town on the map. Then, up ahead, lights. A gas station, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness. Relief flooded through me. I pulled in, the tires crunching against gravel. The station looked off, like it had been abandoned for years, but somehow, the lights were still on. The windows were too dark, like the inside was swallowed in shadow. Something about it made my skin crawl. I almost drove away. But then, my low fuel light blinked on. I needed gas. I stepped out, the cold night air making my skin prickle. As I started pumping, I glanced at the convenience store window. There was a man inside, standing completely still, watching me. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the numbers ticking on the pump. Then, the store lights flickered. I looked up. The man was closer to the glass now, still not moving, just watching. I forced myself to look away. Just pay, get back in the car, and leave. But when I turned toward the register, the clerk was already outside. I jumped, nearly dropping my wallet. He was standing too close, like he had appeared out of nowhere. "You're not from around here," he said. His voice was flat, empty. I forced a smile. "Just passing through." The man didn't blink. "You should go." A sharp unease settled in my chest. He wasn't smiling, wasn't joking. He looked genuinely afraid. I swallowed hard. I was just... Then I heard it. A low, distant scream. It came from the woods behind the gas station. My blood ran cold. The clerk's face hardened. "It in your car. Now." I didn't argue. I yanked the pump out, tossed my wallet into the passenger seat, and threw the car into reverse. The clerk backed toward the store, watching me with wide, fearful eyes. And then, just before I sped off, I saw the man inside the store again, standing right at the glass, smiling. I didn't stop driving, didn't check my phone, didn't even breathe until I saw the highway again. I nearly cried in relief, slamming my foot on the gas. Then, a notification popped up on my phone. GPS signal restored. I glanced down, and my stomach dropped, because the screen showed something impossible. It said I had been driving in circles for nearly an hour. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. At the bottom of the screen, in red letters, "Route unavailable. Ashwood does not exist." A cold dread settled in my bones. I looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty. No gas station, no town, nothing. like it had never been there at all. I never told anyone what happened that night. But sometimes, when I check my GPS history, I see the same glitch. A route that leads to nowhere. A town that doesn't exist. And every time I pass an empty stretch of highway, I wonder, if I took the wrong turn again, would I find it waiting for me? I was only 10 when I realized something was wrong with my uncle. Growing up, Uncle Teddy was my favorite relative. He wasn't like the other adults. He never talked down to me, never made me feel like a kid. He'd let me stay up late watching scary movies, sneak me candy when my mom wasn't looking, and tell me stories about his life on the road. He was a trucker, always passing through town every few months, staying for a couple of nights before heading back out onto the highways. But whenever he left, something strange always happened. People went missing. It wasn't something I noticed at first. At 10 years old, I didn't pay much attention to the news. But one night, I overheard my mom and dad talking in the kitchen. "They found another one, down by the river," my dad muttered. My mom's voice was tight. "Same as the others?" A pause. "Yeah, they're saying it might be the same guy." I remember sitting in the dark, listening, not fully understanding but feeling a cold wave of unease crawl through me. The next morning, Uncle Teddy packed up and left again, and I didn't see him for months. By the time I turned 15, the disappearances had become a pattern. Every few months, someone in town would go missing. A hitchhiker, a waitress, a teenager walking home late at night. The police never found bodies, just clothes abandoned by the highway, wallets left untouched. And every time, Uncle Teddy had just left town. I started noticing other things about him, too. The way he never let anyone near his truck. The way he always washed his hands too long, like he was scrubbing something off his skin. The way he would stare at people when he thought no one was looking. Then, one night, I found something I wasn't supposed to see. It was late, past midnight. Uncle Teddy was staying at our house for a couple of days, and I couldn't sleep. I got up to grab some water when I noticed the kitchen light was on. Curious, I peeked around the corner. He was standing at the table, his back to me, a large duffel bag unzipped in front of him, and inside, I saw a woman's purse, a pink jacket, a pair of sunglasses, the lenses cracked. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. I knew that jacket. It had belonged to a girl from my school, the one who had gone missing last month. I must have made a noise because Uncle Teddy froze. Then, slowly, he turned his head. For the first time in my life, he didn't look like Uncle Teddy. His expression was cold, empty, like he was calculating something. Then, he smiled, a slow, knowing grin, and in the softest voice he said, "You should be in bed, kiddo." My legs nearly buckled beneath me. I muttered some excuse and ran back to my room, slamming the door. I didn't sleep. I barely breathed. The next morning, Uncle Teddy acted like nothing had happened. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, cracking jokes with my dad. The duffel bag was gone. By noon, he had packed up his truck and was on the road again. I never told anyone, not at first, because who would believe me? Uncle Teddy was loved. Everyone in town thought he was the best guy in the world. But I knew better. And the older I got, the more I started putting the pieces together. He always drove the same routes, highways that cut through empty stretches of farmland, forests, and deserts. He never stayed in one place too long, and no one ever knew exactly where he was at any given time. Then, when I was 23, I got a phone call. It was my mom. She sounded off. Teddy got arrested. My stomach dropped. They caught him in another state, pulled over at a rest stop. The police had found a woman in the back of his truck, bound, gagged, but alive. I remember sitting down hard, my whole body going numb, because if they caught him this time, that meant all the other times. All the people who had vanished when he left town. He had gotten away with it. He never went to trial. 2 days before his court date, he hung himself in his jail cell. No confession, no final words, just gone. But I can't stop wondering, how many people did he really take? And how many will never be found? Sometimes, I still dream about that night in the kitchen. The duffel bag, the pink jacket, and Uncle Teddy's smile. Like he knew I had figured him out. Like he was wondering if I'd be his next one. I always thought babysitting was easy money. I mean, how hard is it to sit in someone's house for a few hours, watch TV, and make sure a kid doesn't stick a fork in an electrical socket? That's what I thought, until the Callaway job. It was a last-minute gig. My usual family canceled, and I got a text from Mrs. Callaway, a woman I had never met before, saying she needed a sitter ASAP. Her house was a few miles out of town, isolated at the end of a long dirt road. The kind of place that didn't show up right on GPS. That should have been my first warning sign. I pulled up around 7 p.m., the sun dipping low behind the trees. The house was big, old, with those wraparound porches that looked straight out of a horror movie. Mrs. Callaway met me at the door, looking flustered. "Thank God you came," she said, ushering me inside. "I was worried I wouldn't find someone in time." She was nervous, speaking too fast, her hands fidgeting as she handed me a list of instructions. Her son, Oliver, was already in bed, she said. No need to check on him. That should have been my second warning sign. She grabbed her purse and coat. "I'll be back by midnight. Call if you need anything." And just like that, she was gone. I locked the door behind her, let out a breath, and plopped onto the couch, ready to zone out for the next 5 hours. Then, at 8:42 p.m., I heard it. A soft thump upstairs. I froze, my stomach tightening. I glanced at the baby monitor screen sitting on the coffee table. Oliver's crib was empty. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my phone and texted Mrs. Callaway. "Hey, is Oliver supposed to be in his crib right now?" No answer. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Maybe he climbed out? Maybe he was just wandering around upstairs? I turned up the baby monitor volume. At first, just static. Then, a whisper. Not a child's whisper. A man's. "Go back downstairs." I nearly dropped the monitor. No. 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 I ran to the staircase, my hands shaking as I flicked on the hall light. "Oliver?" I called, my voice unsteady. Silence. I swallowed hard and forced myself up the stairs. The hallway was dim, the floorboards creaking under my weight. Oliver's door was half open. I stepped inside. The crib was empty, and written on the wall, in childlike scrawl, were 3 words. "Who is Oliver?" I ran out of that room so fast I nearly tripped. My hands fumbled for my phone as I sprinted down the hall. I called Mrs. Callaway, my heart slamming in my chest. She picked up on the first ring. "Mrs. Callaway," I gasped. "Oliver. He's not in his crib. Someone's in the house." Silence. Then, in a low, trembling voice, she said, "Get out. Now." The way she said it, like she was barely breathing, made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Mrs. Callaway, he's not my son." My blood ran cold. "What?" I whispered. She was crying now, panicked, terrified. "The man upstairs, the one you heard, that's not my son." A sound creaked behind me. Slow, heavy footsteps. I turned just in time to see a shadow move at the top of the stairs. Tall, too tall. I ran. I flew down the stairs, nearly twisting my ankle as I grabbed my keys off the counter. My fingers fumbled with the lock, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps were getting closer. Finally, the lock clicked open. I threw the door open and ran for my car, the cold night air burning my lungs. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was following me. I yanked open the car door, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. My hands shook violently as I started the engine, and just before I hit the gas, I glanced up. Through the windshield, a face was staring at me from the second-floor window, smiling. I tore out of the driveway, my tires kicking up gravel. I didn't stop driving until I was 10 miles away. When I finally pulled over, my whole body was trembling. I checked my phone. One new message. Unknown number. "You shouldn't have gone upstairs." I never spoke to Mrs. Callaway again. I never went near that house. But sometimes, late at night, I hear static coming from my phone. And sometimes, I dream about that voice. That whisper. "Go back downstairs." I never should have answered the phone that night. It was a Tuesday, a normal night, like any other. I was home alone, my roommate Lena staying at her boyfriend's place, which meant I had the apartment to myself. I planned on getting some work done, maybe watching a few episodes of some mindless show and calling it an early night. But then, at exactly 11:42 p.m., my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost didn't pick up. Almost. Hello? For a second, there was nothing. Just dead air. Then, a voice. Low, raspy, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of gravel. Do you know what's under your bed? A slow, sickening chill crawled up my spine. Who is this? I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. Silence. I pulled the phone away and checked the number. No caller ID. Probably a prank. I hung up. For a few minutes, I sat there, staring at my phone, trying to shake off the unease creeping through me. Then, it rang again. Same number. This time, I let it go to voicemail. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed. One new message. I hesitated before pressing play. The same raspy voice filled my ears. Slow. Dragged out. I can see you. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. My heart slammed against my ribs. No. 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 I glanced at the window. The blinds were closed. Every door was locked. Just a prank. It had to be. I forced out a breath, shaking my head. Ignore it. Don't engage. I turned my phone off and went to bed. But sleep never came. I lay in the dark, every little sound magnified, my ears straining for something, anything, out of place. At 3:07 a.m., I woke up to a noise. A soft rustling. I held my breath. It was coming from the floor, from under my bed. My entire body locked up. Slowly, so slowly, I reached for my phone. I turned it on, the glow of the screen barely illuminating the room. Then, my phone buzzed. A new text message. From the same number. It was just 2 words. Look down. A cold, suffocating fear wrapped around my throat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. Then, I heard breathing. Right under me. I did the only thing I could. I jumped out of bed, landing hard on the floor. My hands scrambled for the light switch, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The lamp flicked on. I dropped to my knees and looked under the bed. Nothing. The space was empty. But the sheet that had been hanging down? It was pushed up, like something had been there moments ago. I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I checked the message again. But this time, it was gone. Deleted. My entire body went cold. I wasn't staying in that apartment another second. I grabbed my keys, threw on my shoes, and ran out the door without even looking back. I drove to Lena's boyfriend's house and banged on the door until someone let me in. I didn't tell them what happened. I just said I couldn't sleep and needed to get out of the apartment. The next morning, when I went back home, I told myself I had imagined it, that it was a prank or a nightmare or some weird mix of both. I told myself I was safe. I was wrong. That night, Lena came home. We sat on the couch, watching TV, and for the first time in 24 hours, I felt normal again. Then, Lena's phone rang. An unknown number. She frowned. Weird. Who calls this late? She answered. At first, I thought the call had dropped. Then, slowly, the color drained from her face. She looked at me, her hands trembling, and in a shaky whisper, she said, "They're asking if I know what's under my bed." I grabbed her phone and hung up instantly. A second later, my phone buzzed. A new text. "You shouldn't have left." We packed our bags and left that night. We moved out of that apartment within a week. But even now, years later, I still get the occasional phone call from an unknown number. I never answer, but sometimes, when I check my voicemail, I hear breathing. I was 17 when I found out my dad wasn't who I thought he was. Growing up, my father was everything to me. He wasn't the warmest man, but he was steady, reliable. The kind of dad who woke up at 5 a.m. for work every morning, who paid the bills on time, who never let the gas in my car drop below half a tank. My mom died when I was 4, so it was just the 2 of us. He raised me alone, taught me how to ride a bike, how to swim, how to shoot a gun. We lived in a quiet town in Montana, where everyone knew each other. No crime, no big events, just an uneventful life in a place where nothing ever happened. And then, one night, everything changed. I was home alone. My dad had gone on a fishing trip with some buddies, which wasn't unusual. He loved being out in the wilderness, and I was old enough to take care of myself for a few days. It was late, around 11 p.m., when I heard a knock at the door. A slow, deliberate knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hesitated before getting up, checking the peephole. A man stood on the porch, middle-aged, rough-looking, with a thick beard and narrow, watchful eyes. Something about him felt off. I didn't open the door. "Can I help you?" I called through the wood. The man was silent for a moment. Then, in a low voice, he said, "I'm looking for Jack Holloway." My breath caught in my throat. That was my dad's name, but no one called him that. Everyone just called him Holloway or Mr. H. Something about the way this man said it, like he knew my father personally, sent a chill through me. "He's not home," I said cautiously. "He's on a trip." Silence. Then, the man smiled. Not a normal smile. A slow, creeping grin, like he had just heard a private joke. "That's all right," he said. "I'll wait." I backed away from the door. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. It rang 4 times before he picked up. I didn't even give him a chance to speak. "Dad, there's some guy at the door asking for you." Silence. Then, "What does he look like?" His tone was flat, controlled, but there was something underneath it. Something like fear. I told him. Another long pause. Then, in the calmest voice I've ever heard him use, he said, "Listen to me. Do not open the door. Do not talk to him. Lock every door and window. I'm coming home now." My stomach dropped. I had never heard my father sound scared before. "What's going on?" I whispered, but he had already hung up. The man knocked again, louder this time. "Hey kid," he called out. "Come on. Just open up for a second." I backed away further. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The back door handle rattled. There were 2 of them. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and locked myself in the bathroom. I sat in the bathtub, gripping the knife so tight my hands hurt. And then, footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Inside the house. I clenched my teeth, trying to control my breathing. Whoever was out there was walking around like they owned the place. I heard them go through the kitchen, then the living room. Then, they stopped, right outside the bathroom door. I could hear breathing. Then, a whisper. "You don't know, do you?" My entire body locked up. "Know what?" I barely choked out. A low chuckle. Then, silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the knife, waiting. Eventually, I heard tires screeching outside. A car door slammed. Then, gunfire. I heard my dad's voice. Angry, terrified, shouting words I couldn't make out. By the time I found the courage to crawl out of the bathtub, it was over. The 2 men were gone. My dad stood in the living room, a gun in his shaking hands. I had never seen him like that before. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. He didn't answer. For a long time, he just stared at the floor, breathing hard. Then, finally, he said, "There's something I need to tell you." And that's when I found out who my father really was. His real name wasn't Jack Holloway. He had changed it 20 years ago. Before I was born, he had been involved in something bad. He wouldn't tell me the details, but from the way he looked at me, like he was afraid I'd never look at him the same way again, I knew it was serious. Dead serious. The 2 men? They had been looking for him for years, and they had finally found us. The next morning, my dad packed up everything important. He told me to grab what I could carry. We were leaving town. That was the last time I ever saw the house I grew up in. We disappeared. New state, new names, new lives. To this day, I don't know what my dad did. I don't know who those men were. I don't even know if they're still looking for us. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up to a sound. A slow, deliberate knock. And every single time, I wonder if they've finally found us again. I never imagined my dream vacation would end with a missing persons report. When I arrived in Lisbon, Portugal, in early 2022, I was looking for an escape. I had just turned 24, and after years of feeling stuck in the same dull cycle of work and routine, I finally had enough money saved to see the world. I planned to backpack through Europe alone, something I had fantasized about since I was a teenager. The plan was simple. 3 months, no fixed itinerary, just freedom. Lisbon was my first stop. For the first few days, everything was perfect. The streets were beautiful, the food was incredible, and the people I met were friendly. I stayed in a small hostel for solo travelers, made a few friends, and spent my days exploring. Then I met him. I had been using a dating app to meet locals, not for anything serious. just to make connections, get recommendations, maybe find someone fun to explore the city with. His name was Miguel. He was charming, spoke perfect English, and said he was a photographer. His profile was filled with pictures of landscapes and old buildings, and he had a friendly, easygoing vibe. We started messaging, and he suggested meeting up at a popular bar near the waterfront. I should have paid more attention to the warning signs. When I arrived, Miguel was already waiting at a table, sipping a beer. He was better looking in person, but something about him felt slightly off. He barely reacted when he saw me, just gave a small smile and gestured for me to sit. I brushed it off. Maybe he was just nervous. We talked for a while, and though he was friendly, I noticed something odd. He asked a lot of personal questions, but barely answered any about himself. At one point, I asked how long he had lived in Lisbon. He hesitated. A while, he said. That was it. I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. That's vague. He smiled, but didn't elaborate. The conversation drifted to travel, photography, and eventually, the topic of nightlife. You should see the real Lisbon, he said. Not just the tourist places. That's when he suggested we go to a bar he knew, a small place off the beaten path where, according to him, no tourists ever go. I hesitated, but I had come here for adventure, right? So I agreed. We walked through the narrow, dimly lit streets, further away from the crowded, lively areas. The farther we got, the quieter the city became. Are we close? I asked. Miguel smiled. Just a little further. Something in my gut twisted. We turned another corner, and suddenly, we were in a dead-end alley. No bar. Just old, abandoned buildings and shadows stretching too far under the flickering streetlights. I stopped walking. Miguel turned to face me, his expression unreadable. I thought you said. I didn't finish my sentence. Because someone else stepped out of the shadows. A man, older, with a shaved head and a jacket too big for his frame. I backed up instinctively, my heart hammering. Miguel just stood there, watching me. Not surprised. Not confused. Like he had been waiting for this moment. The older man muttered something in Portuguese, too low for me to understand. Miguel nodded. That's when I ran. I turned and sprinted out of the alley as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't hear footsteps behind me, but I didn't stop running until I was back in the crowded part of the city. When I reached my hostel, I was shaking. I locked my door, sat on my bed, and checked my phone. Miguel had texted me. Miguel, you left so suddenly. I didn't reply. I checked his profile on the app. Gone. The next day, I went to a police station. I wasn't sure what to report, but I explained what happened. The officer listened carefully, then asked, what was his last name? I hesitated. I didn't know. Miguel had never told me. The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. You're not the first one. A chill ran down my spine. He pulled out a folder and flipped through it before showing me a blurry surveillance photo. Miguel. Or at least, the man I knew as Miguel. The officer's voice was grim. He's not a photographer, and that's not his real name. I felt sick. They told me he had been linked to multiple disappearances over the past few years. Solo travelers. Mostly women. Some were found days later. Some were never found at all. I left Lisbon the next morning. I tried to put it behind me, to move on, but some nights, when I close my eyes, I see Miguel's face, the way he smiled just before leading me into that alley. And I think about the ones who didn't run fast enough, the ones who never made it home.
Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing.